Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Listeners, a couple of years ago now, I met my next guest author at a book launch for a mutual author friend. I'd been following this author for a little while on socials and I knew her debut novel was coming out shortly, but I hadn't had the pleasure of meeting her as yet. At that launch, myself and a couple of other authors present managed to convince this newbie novelist that she absolutely needed to have a book launch and proceeded to connect her with the people to make that happen. And in the process, I landed myself the honour of helping her launch that book only a couple of weeks later. I am, of course, speaking of the immensely talented Amy Hutton, a Sydney-based author. Amy grew up on the Northern Beaches and became an award-winning television producer. But about 7 years ago now, Amy gave up her job in network television to pursue her love of writing. Sit, Stay, Love, Amy's first novel, was published by Simon Schuster in 2023, and Amy followed that up with her second novel, Love from Scratch, only a year later. Amy describes herself as the writer of swoony love stories, and having read all three of her books now, listeners, I can definitely attest to the veracity of that description. In the years since that first fortuitous meeting, I've had the very great pleasure of interviewing Amy several times for different events, and today I am honoured to welcome Amy for the first time to Talking Aussie Books on the occasion of the imminent publication of her third novel, Ghosted, a delightfully dark and sexy paranormal romance published by Atria Books. Hello and welcome to the podcast, Amy.
Hello, thank you for having me. Yay, I'm so happy to be here.
Congratulations on the new book. And we're like really a mere days away from it hitting the shelves here in Australia, just in time for Halloween, which is significant given its paranormal romance. How are you feeling? Nervous, excited? Tell me.
I feel excited because this book has been such a long time love affair for me, and to actually see it getting out into the world is something that I wasn't sure would ever happen, certainly not like this. So the fact that it's happening is just, it's a little bit equal parts exciting and like, oh my God, I literally can't believe it. Obviously, I'm nervous. I think all authors are nervous when their book's first about to come out because you don't know, how it's going to go. But so far, like from ARC reviews and stuff, it's been quite well received. So I've got to hope that that carries on, and it's very pretty and people like the look of it. And as you say, it's coming into Halloween and it's set at Halloween, and paranormal romances are, having a moment at the moment. So people are sort of seeking them out. So all that is great, but it doesn't stop me being, nervous about it. You always want your book to do amazing things, and I probably want this one to do amazing things even more than I did the others.
I feel certain that it will. But I guess in thinking about the novel before we started recording, it really does mark a departure from your first two novels in a few significant respects, doesn't it?
Well, there are no animals at all in this book. And everybody asks me that, is there like a ghost dog? And I'm like, no, there's a couple of birds flying overhead. That's about as frogs croaking or something. That's about as animal as it gets. So in that way, it's very different. It's also set in the US, where my other books have been very Australian, one set on the Northern Beaches and one set on the Sunshine Coast and the Northern Beaches. So in that way, yes, it's different. It's obviously being paranormal as well, has some slightly darker elements. But I like to think that it's still my voice and it still sounds like me. And it still has the kind of romance at the center that I really enjoy writing, and the kind of characters that I enjoy writing and that I've become known for. So whereas the subject matter is different, I'm hoping that the voice feels like something people know if they've known my other work.
Yes, I would agree with that. Absolutely. So yeah, just to kind of like recap, Sit, Stay, Love and Love from Scratch were contemporary romances set in Australia. They both had what I love referring to, and a term which I did not coin, but which I loved, was a pet forward theme.
Claire Fletcher coined that one. That was her.
And I love saying it. I love it just because it was so unusual. I'd never heard of that term before. And every time I think of your novels now, I think of these pet forward books. And so, yeah, in addition to this abundance for animals in those two stories, you were exploring love in different forms and some very identifiable tropes. And Ghosted is a very identifiable romance story, but it is set in a very different world. So I wondered if you could kind of take us through your decision to write this story and how long had the idea been brewing in your mind before you actually began writing?
This was actually the first thing I wrote. So this was written before Sit, Stay, Love and Love from Scratch, both of which I adore. I was talking to someone about Love from Scratch the other day and she'd just finished reading it. I was like, a bit late, but like she's a really good friend. It took her a year. And we were talking about, she was just saying, I think it's great. And I was saying how much I love that book. But this book, Ghosted, was the first thing I wrote. And it was a story that had been kind of just noodling away with me. I hadn't written a full-length manuscript at the point of time where I attacked Ghosted. I had done some short stories and some fan fiction and stuff like that. So I had been writing and blogging and always writing. And I wrote professionally as well, because as part of my television career, I wrote scripts and things like that. But this idea kept coming up in my head and I tried to sort of launch into writing it a few times, but just kind of found with my day job, which was pretty intense, creative anyway, all day, that by the time I sort of got home, it was really, to be honest, the last thing I felt like doing. And I think I would go really well for a short amount of time and then I would just stop again because I'd just get tired. But it was just this story that just wouldn't leave me alone. And so, as you say, eventually I went, well, I really want to write it because it just would not let me sleep at night. It had got to the point. And so that's when I decided to leave full-time work. I was lucky that where I worked were happy to let me go contract so I could continue to work a little bit, and dug into writing the full manuscript. I would be what I'd call a bit of a spooky girl. I really love horror and I love spooky stuff. I love Halloween. I love, all that kind of thing. I love paranormal romance. And so for me, that would just felt like the obvious place I was going to start writing. So the idea, who knows where the idea came from, because I never really know where the idea comes from. But I will say that the first draft was a little different to where I ended up in the second draft, because when I sort of read my first draft, and like I said, I was a very green writer at that point in time. I was doing a lot of courses and stuff, trying to learn craft as I was writing it. When I read the first draft, I realized that a lot of what I felt in my heart and knew in my head about the story just hadn't really made it onto the page in the way that I thought it would. I relate it back to when I used to make promos for movies, and I think it made all the sense in the world because I just watched a 2-hour movie and then I've condensed it down to 30 seconds, and someone would say, I don't understand what that bit means. And it's because you've watched the whole thing, so it's really fresh in your head, but they're only seeing a snapshot of it. And that's kind of how I felt with what happened with the first draft. I knew the characters. I knew the story really, really well, but that hadn't gone onto the page in quite the way that I thought it would. So when I approached draft 2, I actually stepped away from the story and wrote a whole lot of short stories about the characters and the place and really sort of dug into it that way, just to build it a bit more clearly in my own head so that I could get it out. And that in many ways changed the story quite significantly and became the story that it is now.
And you had some encouragement with an earlier version of the manuscript through Romance Writers of Australia. Am I right in saying that?
I had some encouragement. I was not the first draft, but probably was the second draft or maybe even the third. I started pitching it, but I was also entering competitions, and it was Romance Writers of America. So I entered their paranormal chapter competition and it won that year, Light Paranormal, in the Light Paranormal category. They've got lots of different categories, and mine won Light Paranormal. And I got really great feedback from the publishers and the editors who were the judges on that. I remember one of them was like, I did not know I needed a paranormal rom-com. And I mean, paranormal rom-coms are now that's a thing now, but maybe at that point in time, which was a few years ago, it wasn't, a thing as much. They were a little bit more serious and darker. And, my tone is often a lot lighter with the banter and all that kind of thing. But yeah, it won a couple of awards. I was pitching it really actively and I was getting material requests and I was getting really great feedback. But when I was going out with it to try and find a publisher or an agent, paranormal just wasn't doing anything at that point in time. So I would get, look, we really love this, but we're just not looking for this kind of story at the moment. We don't have anywhere to put it. And that was basically the kind of feedback I was getting. And I was working on another paranormal story at the same time as pitching this one when Sit, Stay, Love dropped into my head. And then I went, you know what, I'm just going to write that, see where that goes. And that one was the one that took off.
Yeah, fantastic. So 2 manuscripts down the line or 2 published novels down the line, at what point do you say to your publisher, I have this paranormal romance and I wonder if you would consider it?
Well, I think I probably flagged it really early when I first got the conversation about, we like Sit, Stay, Love, what else you got? And I panicked and asked a few people, what does that mean? And had to put through a document. And I'm sure that it was on there. I know it was on there. But I also always knew that that was not something that I thought they were going to look at. I looked at Simon and Schuster's list. I couldn't see anything like that on their list. I thought, but it showed that I had been writing and sort of exploring other stories. So I was happy to put it on there. I think I really started talking about it to my publisher when Ali Hazelwood brought out Bride. So when we heard that Ali Hazelwood, a very contemporary rom-com, successful author, was bringing out a paranormal, I remember going, oh my gosh, that's like that could be a game changer if that takes off. Maybe that's going to be a door opening to the genre again. And I don't know if it was her and Bride that really got it kickstarting again, but after that it did kickstart. And I remember it was actually, I think it was at lunch when Sit, Stay, Love around its launch day. I think that was the first time I started talking about it. So they knew about it. They did not ask to see it or anything like that, but they knew about it and were like, oh, yeah, sounds interesting. But it wasn't until we started talking about what my third book was going to look like. And I had a couple of finished manuscripts. I had 3 finished manuscripts, including this one, and a whole lot of ideas. So we were talking about everything. And I kind of came back and went, and, I've got that paranormal romance. But of course, timing is everything. And this time paranormal romance was back in the market. And we were seeing big romance writers like B.K. Borison starting to talk about their paranormal romances that were going to be coming out this year. And so it was just like timing. And so my publisher was like, okay, don't sort of say it like that. Paranormal romance is having a moment. Let's read it. And so she read it. She'd read the other 2 manuscripts already. So she read it and she was like, yep, we're going to go with this one. Pretty big moment. When I got the call saying we're going out with Ghosted, it was a very big moment because it was just like, I can't believe it after all this time. And it was a story that I'd never stopped believing in and I never stopped working on. Even when I was working on other stories, I would suddenly have like a thought and I'd go, oh my gosh. So I might spend a week working on a part of Ghosted just to bring in this thought. And obviously, as I'm writing, my writing's getting better and my voice is changing. And so that's rolling through Ghosted as well. And I will say that when my publisher was like, send me the manuscript, I said to her, I haven't read it from beginning to end for like a little bit. Can I have till mid next week, which was like about 5 days, to just go over it and make sure that there's nothing that I'm not happy with or jumps out at me? And she's like, yeah, of course. But what I actually did in that 5 days was change it from third person to first person point of view, from the female's point of view. It was always her story, even in third person. But I just felt like it would be stronger in her voice and that her character would be stronger. So I pretty much didn't sleep because apart from, you've got to rewrite the whole thing, then you want to read it to get it back over. And that, it's 93,000 words or something. It takes a while to go through. So it was like 5 days of about 2 or 3 hours sleep a night. So I was like waking up 5 o'clock in the morning going on. But I think it was absolutely 100% the right thing to do. And I think it really changed the book and just, leveled it up a little bit.
Okay, so I think we've talked around the story a fair bit at the moment, but before we launch into what the story's about, for the benefit of readers who don't actually know what a paranormal romance is, can you give us a bit of an explanation?
I always call it like a spooky romance. So paranormal romance can be like, mine is real world with human characters who might have special abilities and ghosts and that sort of haunting aspect. But paranormal can be vampires. It can be vampires and humans having a romance. It can be vampires and werewolves having a romance. It can be fae. They're usually set in this world, but with otherworldly creatures or otherworldly situations sitting in this world. So whereas fantasy is set in more of a fantastical world that might be created, a paranormal romance is more often than not set in our world, but with not quite real characters, as in they might be traditional sort of horror movie characters or something like that.
The terms get bandied about, but I think people don't necessarily really understand what that entails and what this genre entails.
Yeah, and I think with all stories that have romance in it, that is always the key element. So it doesn't really matter if it's a vampire and a werewolf, having a love affair. It's the love affair that is the heart of the story, which is with all romance, it's got to be bigger. Romance has got to be the thing that sits above everything else. So, and I think that's what's really interesting about paranormal, and what I've found interesting about some people who have read Ghosted, who have never read paranormal before, but are reading it because of me. And they've gone, oh, I really enjoyed it because I didn't realize it was just going to be, a really character-based romance story like they are, it just with all this other stuff around it. So I think that's a thing about paranormal as well.
Fantastic. Okay, so can you tell us more about Holly and her circumstances when we meet her?
So Holly Daniels is a psychic. From a very early age, she started to see ghosts. So she's that kind of psychic. She's not the I can see the future kind of psychic. She can see ghosts, and she has developed a skill as part of her gift to be able to expel them from this world. So she makes a living doing that. She lives in New York, and she makes a living going to people's haunted houses and getting rid of the ghosts. She doesn't know where they go. She doesn't really care. She doesn't like ghosts. They've really haunted her life since she was a child, and it's made her life very difficult, made her very different, and has made her feel very other, both within her family and within the world. So she has kind of pulled away, I think, from society and family and community quite a bit because she feels so different. And even if people aren't looking at her like that, that's how she feels like people are looking at her. But she's really brave in that she will go in and face a ghost with no dramas, be tossed around the room a little bit, okay, and do what she has to do. She's very kind in the way that she is with her clients. She's really respectful of the fact that they're going through something that they shouldn't have to, and she wishes they didn't have to. She goes through it. She knows how bad it is. So she's very respectful and kind with them. But on the flip side of that, she's very scared of the world and how the world perceives her, and of being part of the world of the living, as she calls it. She can deal with the dead without any drama. The living terrify her.
Yeah, absolutely. And so then Callum comes into her life, or reappears in her life, at the point where we start to get to know Holly. So tell us about the story. What happens?
Callum Jeffries, he's a paranormal investigator and a podcast host. And he runs like a podcast that's a bit of a ghost hunting podcast, so on YouTube or whatever, but he goes to haunted houses, but he actually debunks fake hauntings. That's he's a true believer. And he was raised by an aunt who sort of got him into all the spooky stuff. And so he's a true believer. And Holly and him came together a couple of years prior to this, but things happened in their lives and they haven't seen each other for a couple of years until he, out of the blue, contacts Holly to ask for her help to investigate a very famous and infamous haunted house in a small town on Long Island, New York, called East Mill. It's a place that's never been investigated before. And Holly is part like not wanting to go because she doesn't want to get drawn back into Callum's world, but he still intrigues her, and the house really intrigues her, and she's not quite sure why. But something about the house really gets under her skin. And so she decides to go. And so they take the trip from New York to stay in this little B&B and investigate this haunting in this town that has a history that goes right back to the first settlers of America and Long Island, New York, and have always been haunted by a house that has been on this land and owned by this particular family that own this house.
An absolutely fascinating setup, Amy. And I kind of want to go back to Holly and Callum just for a moment. I mean, they're both fascinating characters, to say the least. They're both immersed in this paranormal world, but they're both also solitary characters. And you talked about Holly being her feelings of otherness and her isolation, and Callum in many ways is similar, and this both sets them apart from other people, but I feel it's something that brings them together in many ways. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's something that she is very surprised to see in him, in the way he was raised, and his particular family circumstances made him feel very different growing up as well, and felt very other. And even though, you look at Callum, who's, obviously good looking because he's a romance hero, but also he seems very confident on the outside. You don't realize until you speak to him that a lot of what happened to him when he was growing up, like her, is carried with him. And that has made him be a very kind of, he really only has one good friend, even though he's all sort of charm. He doesn't really go out into the world as much as you would think somebody like that would, because they are very similar. And that's something it takes Holly a while to see. And I think it's something that eventually draws them together. I love mirroring in characters. It's one of my favorite things in anything I read or watch, and I often write it, is this something within each other that you recognize as being something like yourself. Without knowing it, when they first meet, they realize that they're kind of mirroring each other in their experiences or their journeys, or their beliefs or something like that. And I feel like Holly and Callum are kind of like that, and I think that is what really brings them together. But it takes Holly a while to see past the gloss of Callum, to see who he really is. And I don't think that's something Callum ever hides. He's actually quite open with his feelings, but it's a lot for Holly to be open. So it takes her a while to see him.
I love that you've cloaked him in this. He's obviously an exceptionally good looking guy, but also the fact that he just seems to be able to charm whoever crosses his path. He's not only got charm, but it's charisma as well. So it is surprising that he has this inner vulnerability in many ways.
I think it's something that I've explored before as well, because I don't think you can ever judge people by how they look. You don't know what's going on inside them, and you don't know what their inner life is like, and you don't know what their life or their past is like. And I think we have a tendency to judge, beautiful people and think that their life is going to be perfect, but their life can be just as messed up as anybody else's. I think we have a tendency to see people who maybe have that kind of charm and charisma and that easiness as possibly not as deep as someone who isn't like that. And that's entirely untrue. So I like to see that my heroes are not as perfect underneath their perfect exterior, and not in a negative way, but in a very human and real way.
So they team up together to investigate the East Mill haunted house, and this challenges them in both unexpected ways. And the history of the house actually brings up 17th century witch trials in the area. And you mentioned before that the house has long haunted the area. I have actually been fascinated by historical witch trials for such a long time, which occurred not only in the US, but elsewhere in the world. So I wanted to ask you, Amy, what's your fascination, and why was this something you wanted to explore in this novel?
This is a really interesting, and this is why I feel like this novel was like synchronicity for me or something. So my aunt lived in East Hampton on Long Island, New York. And my uncle, she's since passed away, but my uncle is still alive. He lives in the West Village in New York in a historic home. And I set some of Ghosted in the West Village. And there is a house at the beginning of Ghosted that is basically based on my uncle's house. It's a historic house built in the very early 1800s. So my initial thought was that I was going to set the story in East Hampton. And because I'd been there quite a lot of times, it's a very historic area. It's also cute and, gorgeous. And I knew they have big old houses out there. And I thought that would be really good. But while I was like coming up with the story, I had this idea in my head that I wanted something about the witch trials in the story. And I thought to myself, well, that rules out setting it East Hampton because we know that the witch trials in North America happened in Salem, right? And so that was end of the 1600s, it was like 1695 or something, happened in Salem. There was 19 people hung, and a gentleman in his 80s was crushed under rocks when they were trying to ask him questions. And then several other people passed in prison as well. And we all know the story of Salem to some degree. You've probably seen or read The Crucible or read something about it. So I was like, you can't set your story in a real town and have fake history. You just can't do that. If you're going to set it in a real town, then it has to have real history. So I was like, oh, damn. And then I thought, well, let me just have a little look. And it turns out that the very first witch trial in North America, which was about 35 years prior to Salem, happened in East Hampton. I was like, what? I had no idea. That was like the moment that I thought, okay, I've got to write this story because that is just weird. And even though I ended up setting the story in a fictional town, which I'll tell you about, but I used the basis for that particular trial. It was one trial, one woman, neighbours. And I used that basis and their names, but just a bit muddled up, as the basis for the start of the historic witch trials in Ghosted. But I ended up not setting it in East Hampton and setting it in a fictitious town purely because there was a couple of years where we couldn't actually get off this island we live on. And I had this big plan of going to East Hampton and doing all the research. And it just kind of got to the point where I was like, I'm not going to hold off, writing this book because I can't get out of the country and go and do the kind of research. And I know I could have done it through Google and stuff, but I really felt like I needed to be more immersed. Even though I'd been there numerous times, I just wanted to get all the streets right and everything. So I ended up taking a page out of Stephen King's book where he sets everything in Maine but fictional towns. So I set it on Long Island but created East Mill, which is actually, in my mind, it's like a melding of East Hampton and Sag Harbor. So it's still got the history and the kind of the gorgeousness and the beaches, but it's got a harbor and there's a little bit more. Sag Harbor is a little bit kind of more quaint, I think, than East Hampton. So I kind of mix those two together. But I used the history of Long Island. I used the history of East Hampton and the Sag Harbor area. I used all that history as the building block for the historical part of my story. Now, obviously, my story is in contemporary, if anybody's asking, but the mystery goes back a long way. So, there is a historical aspect to it. We don't go there. It's not dual timeline or anything, but there is a historical aspect to the mystery.
Found that incredibly fascinating, and it added so much depth to this story, I felt. So I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Amy, that the spirits that Holly and Callum encounter at East Mill House are more powerful than any they've encountered previously. And I know there are reasons for this, which we can't go into without giving away spoilers, but I guess this led me to wonder about the paranormal world and what research you did to bring these encounters alive on the page.
I did a lot of research into ghost hunting. I definitely did that into Callum's side of things. And I did some research into different kind of psychics, how, different psychics see ghosts or interact with spirits and things like that. But I think a lot of the ghost stuff just comes out of my love of that genre and the amount of that stuff that has been fed into my brain over the years. I know this sounds very weird, but horror movies are like comfort food for me. Not all of them. Some of them are like a little bit intense, but there are many that I'm like, oh, I'm really feeling a bit like I need to pick me up. Let's watch Scream, so I'm like that a lot. So not that this is a horror book or anything. So I think a lot of that information is just part of my DNA now because it's always been a part of my life since I was very young. I was in love with vampires when I was very, very young. But certainly aspects of psychics and psychics in New York and how the different powers they have and what are the different kind of powers and how they manifest. And then, yes, definitely, though I have also watched a lot of ghost hunting shows, definitely I did a lot of research into the ghost hunting kind of thing and the tools that they use and that kind of stuff as well. But otherwise, I made them up.
We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but this is a darker story in many ways to your previous two novels. And I understand that you wrote this first. And it's not just because of the paranormal element, but the characters themselves, especially Holly, who we've already spoken about. She's a really different person to anyone else that she's known most of her life. And she's quite isolated and othered in many ways. But also, I feel like the tension and the stakes in this novel are a lot higher. I mean, they kind of have to face some really dangerous circumstances, don't they?
I guess there is kind of a little aspect of horror, just a very light in the background of mine. But yeah, they do. They have to face some pretty trying situations. And I think that really shows who they are as well, particularly Holly. I think you get a really good sense of who Holly is when she's in a crisis. And she's absolutely amazing in a crisis. But they have to face a lot about each other as well as they sort of work together. Even that in itself can be quite confronting for both of them. And I think the mystery at the heart has some darker elements. I mean, when you're talking about witch trials, that's obviously going to be dark. If you're talking about ghosts, there's a bit of creep there. So it's definitely not the Sunshine Coast. Everybody in their cozies romance. I also think there's so much light in it, though, because there's light in the relationship as they start to find each other and trust each other like they do and start to understand each other and lean on each other, but also in their banter. There's a lot of lightness in their banter. There's a lot of lightness in Holly just dealing with her feelings and, how her feelings are coming up and how she actually is trying to navigate them. And I think in some ways there's quite a bit of laughter in this book as well. There's quite a bit of comic moments while they're both trying to deal with stuff. And there's some ghosts that kind of get in the way of things, which, bring a bit of a lighter element as well. So it's dark, but like anything that's dark, it's got some good light because you've got to have that balance.
So I guess I wanted to ask you, will we see more of these types of stories from you, Amy?
I hope so. I really hope so. It certainly is my plan. I feel like I've been given the permission to do it. As much as, let me tell you, I love my other stories as well. And I have so many gorgeous contemporary romance ideas that, I have ticking away in the background. But I really love this genre. And while I feel like I have the okay to write it, that's what I'm going to be focusing on. I've got some great stories. And I'm very much hoping that you'll see more from me in the paranormal universe. Yeah, definitely.
I know you and I have discussed your road to publication before, but I think it's worth talking about again for the benefit of listeners who haven't heard this story or haven't read your work, because your journey to publication was rather swift in the scheme of things in terms of the length of time from pitch to publication. So I wondered if you could talk us through this a bit, Amy.
Yeah, so I was pitching Ghosted for a little while. Sit Stay Love, when I finished that and sort of I got some beta reads on Sit Stay Love, I kind of knew that I had something. I was like, hang on a minute, I think this might be a thing. And everybody who read it was like, oh my God, it's like romance catnip. And so I think I only pitched that 3 times. And on the third time I pitched it at the Romance Writers of Australia in Fremantle to Simon and Schuster. And I honestly thought that I completely blew the pitch because I'm actually really enjoy pitching. And weird, I know most authors don't, but I really enjoy it. I know, it's so weird. I have this thing where they want me to have a great book. They're hoping that my story is amazing. So they're super invested in what I've got to say. And I've got them for, 3 minutes or 7 minutes just to tell them about the thing I love the most in the world. So that's how I choose to look at it. And so I actually really enjoy it. And I'm okay at it because I don't get panicked or anything. But for whatever reason, this particular pitch, I was sweating, like literally, like I had some kind of weird nervous sweat thing happening. I lost my way in my thoughts, my notes. I kept having to tell, it was Cassandra DeBello who was at Simon and Schuster at the time, and I kept having to tell her, oh, I'm messing this up. Oh, I'm so nervous. I'm sweating so much. And she must have just been going. But anyway, so I wasn't expecting anything from this particular pitch, but a week later I got asked for the full manuscript. And I think it was probably about a month after that, I got I really love this story. I'm sharing it with my team. What else you got? And then I think it was probably a few weeks after that that I got the "Are you around? Can we chat?" email. I pitched it in August. I got the offer in the first week of December. Christmas got in the way, so we ended up signing somewhere late January. But it was just because everybody was on holidays all the time. And we came out in August. So it was a year from pitch to release, which was extremely fast. And then Love from Scratch was really equally as fast because we started talking about Love from Scratch before Sit Stay Love came out. I didn't have a contract for that at that point in time, but they signed me up to get Sit Stay Love out. And that was out in June. So it was kind of, I think I signed the contract like in July, or end of July or something. And the book was out in June. So both of those have been very, very fast as opposed to Ghosted. That took a while to get. So I've had both experiences, but yeah, my first two books were whoosh right out. Yeah.
Such an inspiring story, I think, Amy. Yeah, it's really great for aspiring authors to hear these kinds of different experiences that authors have on their road to publication.
You get a lot of advice when you're an aspiring author. You get so much advice. You get everybody telling you, you've got to write every day. You do not have to write every day if you don't want to. You never edit as you go. Just vomit out that first draft. I've done the vomit draft, and honestly, I think my soul left my body while I was trying to do draft 2 because there was so much work. So I will never do that again, which means I do the other thing you're not allowed to do, which is I edit as I go. I just prefer to do that. I like to have a clean first draft. But one of the other things they say is, oh, that first manuscript, that's just like the one that you just like mess around with. You're never going to do anything with it. Put it in the drawer, forget it's there, never show it to anyone and move on. If I'd have done that, I would never have come out with Ghosted for a start, because that was my first manuscript that should have gone in the drawer. And to be honest, when I read the first draft, there was part of me that was kind of like, should I put this in the drawer? Like, people tell you to. But I learned so much reworking that story and building it into the story that it became. So, I think it's a really personal journey becoming an author. It comes to you in all different ways. Everybody experiences it in a different way. And writing, like reading, is a really personal thing as well. And you just have to do what feels right for you.
So much great advice there for the aspiring and even emerging authors that are listening to this podcast today. But I mean, on that, in terms of advice, if you had one thing to say to your unpublished self, what would that be?
I get really stressed about everything to the point where my publishers are now like, we know you get stressed. I would tell myself to just relax and enjoy the journey. You can't control like 99% of it, I want to say. If you're in the traditional space, there's a lot of stuff you have zero control over. Really, the only thing you can control is the writing. And so write and keep writing and write the best you can. And I would tell myself to just try and relax and enjoy the journey and don't get too tense about everything that's happening. That's what I'm trying to do with book 3. I certainly didn't do it with book 1 and 2, but I'm just trying to roll with book 3 and just enjoy that this has happened. And whatever happens next will happen. It's pretty much outside of my control. So, whatever happens next will happen, and just enjoy it. So I would tell myself that.
Well, in terms of your enjoyment levels of this journey with Ghosted, I can see, and we've talked about it before, the beautiful edition that Atria Books have put out. I only got an ARC, and so I haven't actually seen firsthand the gorgeous book that is now or will be available for sale in Australia shortly. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, it's very pretty. I've got it here. I'm going to pull it up. So here it is. So it's hard to see here, but like all the little stars and everything are all sparkly. So they shine. Everything's really glossy and shiny. And I mean, the artwork is it's so beautiful, but also it has these gorgeous ghostly spread edges. So it's just so stunning. The whole book is just I think they've done such a gorgeous job on it.
Yeah.
I'm so thrilled. I love the cover to pieces. It's
Yeah.
just absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah. There's your enjoyment factor going through the roof with that.
Oh, I couldn't believe it. When they told me they were doing spread edges, I was just like, what? And the really exciting thing was that how excited they all were too in the Atria office. They were all like, we're so excited. And I was like, oh my gosh, me too.
Before we wrap up, I kind of wanted to touch on the fact that Ghosted is due to be published in both the US and the UK, as well as in
Yeah.
Australia and New Zealand, which represents another significant milestone in your career. Tell me about that and how are you feeling?
I'm really excited. I'm not going out and talking about it much yet because I just want to get through Australia, New Zealand, which is next week. Obviously, like ebooks and audiobooks are always kind of out globally, whenever anything is released anyway. But I've never had a paperback of my books released internationally. Oh, that's not true actually, because Sit Stay Love was picked up in Hungary. So
Oh,
I
I
have
didn't
a
know that.
Hungarian version. Yeah, I have a Hungarian version of Sit Stay Love. A whole different cover and everything, and all in Hungarian, which I can read like the names of the people in and my dog, Buffy, but nothing else. Ghosted will be out in the UK at the beginning of next year, and then later in the year in the US. They have a much longer lead time in paperback. So it's actually already up for pre-order in like Target and Walmart and Barnes and Noble and everything in the States. So I've never had that before. I'm so thrilled and so excited. And I just hope that people go and buy it. And my friends will. All my friends are like, finally. I think because I'm so focused on Australia, New Zealand right now, it kind of hasn't got out. But it's in Europe too. I've looked it up on like this is me being relaxed. I've looked it up on like, French Amazon and German Amazon and it looks like obviously that's via the UK. It looks like it's getting like a pretty wide release. Canada as well.
So, what are your next steps, Amy? Have you got something else on the boil or you're just focusing on this release right now?
I have been pretty much just focusing on this, but I'm always writing and I am writing another story. I had written it about 87,000 words and realized that I was a long way from the end and knew that that was not going to be right. There were some aspects of the story that I felt weren't working. And rather than just keep writing and then go back and find a way to lose like 30,000 words or something, I decided to go back now. So I've started reworking that. That's the thing that I'm focusing on. I've got that, and I've got a couple of ideas that I've worked up in, often what I do is if I have an idea, I'm not a planner. I think having been published and because your publisher wants to know what you're writing next, I noodle out what I'm doing before I just jump in. I used to just jump in. And I think that that's actually really helpful. But I don't like write like a breakdown or anything. I will do like a back of the book blurb that just gives me a vibe and an idea of what the story is going to be. And so often when I get an idea, I might just do that. I have a document with a whole lot of them in there. I might just work it up and see if it's got any kind of legs in there. And so there's a couple of them that I think have got legs. And if I really do think that, then I might just spend a couple of weeks writing maybe a few chapters and just see how that feels. And then I'll just pop it aside and go back to what I'm actually working on. So I'm working on one story particularly, but I have another couple that, are whips.
Amy, it's always a pleasure for me to chat with you about your work. I adored Ghosted and I simply cannot wait to see what you do next. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you, Claudine. It's always an absolute pleasure to chat to you.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.